Happy Tuesday, everyone. Welcome back to another Tuesday night. There's this thing that human beings do when life gets disorienting. We go back to what we know. When something big happens, when life cracks open, when the future feels unclear, we usually don't become instantly wise and brave. At least I don't. We go familiar. We go practical. We go manageable. We go back to routines or jobs or habits or old instincts, sometimes even old versions of ourselves. Not always by choice. Sometimes we're just tired. Sometimes we're confused. Sometimes doing what we already know how to do feels a lot safer than standing in the unknown. That's where our story begins tonight. A group of Jesus' disciples, the same ones who by now have seen some truly wild things after Jesus' death, are back near the sea. Jesus has been crucified, he's risen, he's appeared to them, and still somehow they're left with the deeply human question of what to do next. So Peter says to them, I'm going fishing. Back to his old job, back to his old expertise. It's such a normal sentence in this story, and that's what I think makes it powerful. Because this story isn't about obvious rebellion or dramatic collapse, it's about drift, about returning to the familiar. About what people do when something world-changing has happened, but they still don't know how to live inside of it yet. I think that's part of why this passage that we'll get to in a minute stands out. Whether you've been in church forever or all of this is pretty new to you, you probably know what it feels like to go back to what feels familiar when life gets hard. To reach for what feels useful or protective, distracting, or at the very least, predictable. And what makes the story so beautiful is that Jesus meets them there in that moment. Not in this polished religious moment, not when they're full of clarity, not when they're obviously getting it right. He meets them in the boat, in the exhaustion, in the confusion, in the ordinary reflex of going back to what they know. That's the kind of story this is. And I don't know about you, but this is exactly the kind of story I need to hear tonight. So I think it might be the exact kind of story some of us need to hear tonight. So let's get into it. This is John chapter 21, verses 1 through 14. It says, after this, Jesus appeared again to the disciples, this time at the Tiberias Sea, the Sea of Galilee. This is how he did it. Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed Twin, Nathanael from Canaan in Galilee, the brothers Zebedee, and two other disciples who unfortunately just don't get named, were together. Simon Peter announced, I'm going fishing. The rest of them replied, we're going with you. They went out and got in the boat. They caught nothing that night. When the sun came up, Jesus was standing on the beach, but they didn't recognize him. Jesus spoke to them, good morning. Did you catch anything for breakfast? They answered, no. He said, throw the net off the right side of the boat and see what happens. They did what he said, and all of a sudden there were so many fish in it, they weren't strong enough to pull it in. Then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, it's Jesus. When Simon Peter realized that it was him, he threw on some clothes, for he was stripped for work, and dove into the sea. The other disciples, maybe a little bit smarter, came in by boat, for they weren't far from land, 100 yards or so, pulling along the net of fish. When they got out of the boat, they saw a fire laid with fish and bread cooking on it. Jesus said, bring some of the fish you've just caught. Simon Peter joined them and pulled the net to shore, 153 big fish. And even with all of those fish, the net didn't rip. Jesus said, breakfast is ready. Not one of the disciples dared ask, who are you? They knew it was Jesus. Then he took the bread and gave it to them. He did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus had shown himself alive to the disciples since being raised from the dead. There's something almost funny about how flat Peter says it. He just says, I'm going fishing. No speech, no explanation, just, I'm doing this. And the others say, we're going with you. It's such like a normal human sentence. After everything they've been through, what are they supposed to do? Jesus has risen, sure, but resurrection hasn't turned into like some neatly defined 5-step plan for them. They've had encounters, but they still don't have clarity. So Peter goes back to what he knows. And I don't think we should hear that too quickly as some kind of failure or some problem. I think we should hear it, the exhaustion in it, the uncertainty, the instinct to reach for something concrete when everything else feels slippery. A lot of us do this, right? Like when life gets overwhelming, we run to what's familiar. It might not heal us, but it reduces the number of surprises. It reduces the number of things we have to think about. It gives us roles we know how to play, and it just lets us feel competent again. Sometimes after disappointment, we go back to an older, smaller version of ourselves. The version that doesn't risk much. The version that stays busy so that we don't have to feel what's actually going on inside of us. The version that can look functional on the outside while quietly shrinking on the inside. At work, that can look like slipping into autopilot. At home, it can look like defaulting to the same defensive patterns because at least they're familiar. In faith, it can look like doing what you've always done without much expectation that anything living will meet you there. John doesn't dramatize their drift. He just shows us a group of people reaching for the known when the future still feels very unclear. And I think plenty of us know our own versions of Peter's sentence. We say, I'm just going to keep busy, or let's just be practical, or I know how to do this, so I'll stay here. The question underneath all of it is, what do we do when the world has changed, but we still don't know how to live like it's true? So they fish all night and catch nothing. Don't rush past the emptiness of that too quickly, because John doesn't. A whole night of nothing. And these aren't amateurs out there cosplaying as fishermen for some object lesson. Like, this is work they know. This is familiar territory. This is the thing Peter used to do before anybody said, follow me. And even here in this old familiar place with these old familiar skill sets, they come up empty. I don't know about you, but that hits. A lot of transitions in life feel exactly like that. Have you ever experienced a season that's so disorienting that the very thing you go back to for stability stops working the way that it used to? Just nothing seems to work, even the things that you're usually good at. The old pattern doesn't deliver. The old coping mechanism doesn't soothe you like it used to. The old identity doesn't fit like it used to. The old way of surviving starts showing its limits. It's just so frustrating because now you're stuck in two kinds of uncertainty at once. The new life still feels unclear. The old life doesn't work the same anymore. That's a rough place to be. But a lot of transitions feel like that. You can't go fully back even if you try. You're not who you were before. You've seen too much. You've lived too much. Maybe you've been through enough pain or healing or loss or growth or deconstruction or parenthood or failure and recovery. Whatever it is, the old scripts just don't fit cleanly anymore. And at the same time, the new script isn't fully formed yet. So there you are in the dark, doing what used to work, and wondering why it suddenly feels so empty. That's this boat Jesus' friends are in. There's also something humbling here. We assume that if we return to what feels familiar, at least we'll feel competent. But sometimes the night exposes how little control we ever had in the first place. And that's not all bad. Maybe some of our emptiness is diagnostic. Maybe it's revealing that what we've gone back to can't actually hold the weight that we're asking it to carry. Maybe coming up empty is its own kind of mercy, because if the old pattern kept working perfectly, we might never look up. And trust me, I know that that's maddening. I hate it. I prefer this to be the kind of talk where every single one of you, where I can tell you that everything gets easier immediately, and every single one of you leaves here feeling inspired and hydrated and ready to take on the world. But that's not how this text works. It lets them sit in the empty night. Some of us are there right now. You're doing what you know to do, and it's not exactly collapsing, but it's not bearing life either. And underneath is this quiet ache that says, why does this still feel so empty? John 21 says that question may not be proof that you've failed. It might be the beginning of an encounter. Then comes one of my favorite lines in this whole passage. When the sun comes up, Jesus was standing on the beach, but they didn't recognize him. Of course they didn't. Apparently, as we've seen in several of these stories, Jesus decided that one of his post-resurrection hobbies is being unrecognized at first. Mary thought he was a gardener. The disciples in the locked room needed a minute to figure out who this was. Thomas needed wounds. Now this fishing crew sees a guy on the shore, and they have no idea that it's him, which I think should encourage the rest of us. Like, so many people assume that if Jesus were really present, they'd obviously know it. If God were doing something, it'd be unmistakable. But this story says otherwise. Like, in John's resurrection stories, Jesus is often present before they ever know who he is. He's already there before people can name what's happening. He's already moving before anyone has categories for it. I think some of us are way too quick to interpret our confusion as absence. We don't recognize what God's doing, so we assume that he's doing nothing. But Jesus is standing there while they're still tired, still unsuccessful, still unable to read the moment. And then he speaks into their ordinary frustration. He says, "Friends, didn't you catch anything?" Which had to be such an annoying question after a long night of catching nothing. But they just answered no. One word. It's honest. There's no explanation. There's no attempt to salvage their pride. No one says, "No, but the fish are sleeping right now," or "It's a bad time in the season." Just no. There's something powerful, I think, about that little exchange. Jesus doesn't begin with condemnation. He begins with a question that tells the truth, and they answer truthfully. That's often how change starts. At work, in relationships, in your own inner life, one of the hardest and healthiest things you can say is just a simple, "No, this isn't working. No, I'm not okay. No, this pattern of life isn't life-giving anymore." That honesty can open up space. And in this story, it opens space for Jesus to say, "Try again differently." He tells them to throw the net on the other side of the boat. And for Peter specifically, this isn't random, right? It directly echoes an earlier moment when Jesus first called him on another boat after another long, empty stretch, leading to another miraculous catch. It's another moment where Jesus met him right in the middle of his ordinary work and pulled him into a bigger life. And it's happening here again. The stranger gives these expert fishermen nonsensical advice. Like, imagine that you're an expert at this. You've been working all night and come up short. This random guy on the beach is like, "Just throw it over to the other side." But they do it. And just like the first time, suddenly the net is full. It's a small act of trust. That's what I don't want us to miss. Resurrection life often begins in small acts of trust, not giant heroic moments, not in these big emotional fireworks, just small embodied willingness. Throw the net out again. Make the call. Tell the truth. Show up again. Sometimes the next step to new life isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's just responsive. Then once they realize it's Jesus, Peter does Peter things and launches himself into the water because subtlety has never been his gift. The others drag the net in. He leaves it for them to take care of. Everybody gets to shore. And what do they find? Breakfast. That gets me every time. They find a charcoal fire, fish on it, and bread. Jesus doesn't greet their empty night with a lecture. He doesn't stand there with arms crossed saying, "So, what did we learn?" Instead, he already has breakfast going. It's always kind of funny to me that he already had fish. Kind of like, man, but then he asked them for more fish. So he didn't have enough. He needed the fish, 153 of them. It's a beautiful moment. Like, these men are wet and tired and probably embarrassed and still not fully sure of what to do with themselves. And Jesus meets them there with food, with warmth, with something ordinary and tangible and kind. Resurrection apparently includes breakfast, which is good news for everybody. I love that because it rescues faith from becoming too abstract. Like, so much of faith language can drift into this like vague inspiration, like these big lofty claims, this overgeneralized inspiration. The risen Jesus in John keeps showing up in concrete, embodied ways. He speaks names, he shows wounds, he cooks breakfast. That means new life isn't just something that you think about. It's something you eat and share and receive and inhabit. It lands in actual bodies, actual mornings, actual relationships. And there's something else here too. The fire matters. John tells us it's a charcoal fire. The last time that this specific kind of fire showed up in John's gospel, Peter was standing near it denying Jesus. So this breakfast scene is carrying the ache of that memory. Jesus is repairing restoration before the conversation about restoration even starts. We'll get to that story next week. But this is often how grace works. It gets there ahead of you. Before Peter says a word in the next section of this chapter, before the painful questions, before the restoration, Jesus has already fed him and taken care of him, already welcomed him to the shore, already made room for him by the fire. Some of us need to let that sink in. Because when we drift, when we regress, when we go back to our old patterns, we often assume that Jesus will meet us with disappointment. But in John 21, he meets people, tired people, with breakfast on the beach. That doesn't mean that he ignores what needs healing. He doesn't. It means the tone of restoration is set by grace, not humiliation. If you're leading people at work or parenting kids or taking care of kids or trying to repair a friendship, this matters. People change more deeply in the presence of grounded grace than in the presence of shame. Shame may control people's behavior for a minute, but grace creates space where they can honestly breathe. Jesus has the fire going before they've explained themselves. That's just the kind of Savior he is. Now, one easy mistake to make with this passage is to hear it as the disciples got it wrong again, and Jesus helped them get back on track, and just leave it there. But this story, it isn't just about them getting back to being productive. It's about Jesus meeting them in the old place and drawing them forward from there. He doesn't shame their return to the boat. He also doesn't leave them there. He fills the nets. He feeds them on the beach and reminds them that their lives are caught up in something so much bigger than survival. A lot of us have built our lives around surviving because we've had to, around coping, around staying functional. And survival can make you efficient, but it can also make you unavailable. Unavailable to joy, unavailable to tenderness, to risk, unavailable to your calling, unavailable to the person underneath all that fear and all that fatigue. So the disciples in this passage aren't villains, they're survivors. And Jesus meets them there not to scold them for being human, but to call them out of the smaller story that they're slipping back into. That's what resurrection does. It interrupts the story where your worth is your output. It interrupts the story where your future is over because you've regressed or relapsed. It interrupts the story where God is only active in the obviously religious moments. Apparently, Jesus is also active on shorelines, in work clothes, around breakfast. So where have you gone back to what's familiar? Not because it's life-giving, but because it feels easier to manage. Where are you stuck in a version of yourself that feels safe but small? Where have you confused survival with life? Jesus doesn't show up in this story to say, how dare you go back to the life that I drew you out of? He shows up to reveal that even there, even in the relapse into the familiar, he's still calling people into something more alive. And that something more won't always look dramatic. Sometimes it'll look like paying attention. Sometimes it'll look like honesty. Sometimes it'll look like receiving care from others. Sometimes it'll look like trusting his voice over your exhaustion. Sometimes it'll look like letting grace feed you before you try to prove anything to anyone. So before we move to close, it's worth letting this get a little personal. By now, I hope that it is painfully clear. This isn't just a story about some tired disciples a long time ago. This is about us too. It's about the places we drift and the places we come up empty. And the ordinary places where Jesus may be nearer than we have dared to think. So to help you sit with that a few minutes this week, here's just a few reflection questions for you to think through. The first is, what's my version of I'm going fishing? The familiar place or pattern I drift back to when life feels uncertain or overwhelming. Where in my life have I been working hard and still coming up empty? And what might that emptiness be trying to tell me? And finally, what would it look like this week to recognize Jesus in an ordinary place? At work, at home, in a conversation, in a moment of honesty, and respond with one small act of trust. John 21 is such a needed resurrection story because it doesn't happen in a sanctuary. It happens in the aftermath, in the drift, in the return to the routine, in the tired reflex of going back to what used to make sense. And Jesus is there. He's there while they're still coming up empty. He's there before they recognize him. He's there asking honest questions. He's there guiding one small act of trust. He's there with breakfast already on the fire. That tells us something beautiful and deeply practical about resurrection. New life doesn't only meet us at our best. It meets us in the relapse and the fatigue and the confusion. It meets us when we slip back into old patterns. It meets us when we're trying to survive by reaching for the familiar. It meets us in the ordinary places that we'd assume nothing meaningful is happening. And once again, I feel like I probably can't say this enough. Jesus doesn't meet people with shame. He meets them with grace and hospitality. That doesn't mean that he leaves lives unchanged. He won't. This beach scene is already setting up the deeper restoration that's coming for Peter, like I talked about, but the tone is clear. Grace gets there first. Grace lights the fire. Grace makes breakfast. Grace creates the kind of space where people can stop pretending and start becoming alive again. So the invitation tonight is maybe simpler than you expected. Pay attention to where you've gone back. Be honest about what's empty. Don't confuse familiarity with life. And don't assume Jesus has abandoned the ordinary places where you're tired or uncertain or drifting. He may be standing closer than you think, asking one honest question and inviting one small response. And for those of us trying to live this out in the everyday places of our lives, that matters a lot. In our homes, at our jobs, in our friendships, in this church, we can become the kind of people who reflect that same grace. The kind that doesn't humiliate people for being human. The kind that tells the truth and still makes breakfast. The kind that believes new life can begin again in very ordinary places. So may we be honest about the places we drift back to. May we recognize Jesus in ordinary moments we almost overlook. May we trust his voice when our old patterns leave us empty. And may we become people who receive grace deeply and offer it generously. Would you pray with me? God, would you find us in the emptiness? Would you give us a spark of hope for those of us who are feeling like nothing's working? God, would you give us the courage to respond with one small act of trust, believing that you are always calling us to something deeper and something better, even when we go back to what we've known. God, thank you that you don't leave us there. God, thank you that you meet us with grace and not shame. May we be people that do that for one another. We love you, God. It's in your name we pray. Amen.